This is the true story behind the most famous act of revenge in Japanese history, and almost none of the version you already know is accurate. The villain had the wrong name for 2.5 centuries. The hero, according to his own shogun's private records, was an undisciplined young man who never should have inherited his title in the first place. Plays, prints, and films have turned this raid into a clean story about loyalty, but it wasn't even a legal vendetta under the laws of the time. What actually happened on a snowy night in January of 1703 is stranger, slower, and far more contested than the legend, and the men who carried it out left behind a paper trail detailed enough to prove it. The story starts in Edo Castle on April 17, 1701, in the middle of the Genroku era, a stretch of decades when Japan was wealthier and more stable than it had been in generations under the Tokugawa shogunate. The shogun's court was hosting imperial envoys from Kyoto for an annual ceremony that day, and a 60-year-old court official named Kira Yoshihisa had been put in charge of every detail of the protocol. Popular retellings called this man Kira Yoshinaka for 2.5 centuries straight, a name so deeply embedded in plays and prints that even serious reference works repeated it without question. It's the wrong name. Yoshihisa held the hereditary post of Master of Shogunal Ceremony, responsible for everything from seating arrangements to which robes got worn at which event, and part of that job meant training a 34-year-old daimyo named Asano Naganori in exactly that kind of etiquette. Naganori had been assigned to host the imperial envoys that day, a duty Yoshihisa himself had personally taught him to perform. Somewhere between a side corridor known as the Corridor of Pines and a meeting that never quite happened on schedule, Naganori drew his short sword and attacked Yoshihisa from behind, striking him twice and shouting that Yoshihisa had forgotten his grievance. An eyewitness named Kajiwara Yosobe Yoriteru happened to be on duty that day as a messenger for the shogun's wife, and he wrote down exactly what he saw, an account that survives to this day. What it doesn't contain is any explanation of what that grievance actually was. Naganori never said, and he never got the chance to. Guards restrained him immediately, and what followed was 6 hours that should have terrified him if he'd had time to think about it. Arrest came at 1 in the afternoon, the death sentence by 4, and by 6 that evening he was dead by his own hand, having committed seppuku without a single court of law ever hearing his side of it. Kira Yoshihisa, the man who'd actually been attacked, walked away from the whole encounter facing no punishment at all. And that's the detail everything else in this story revolves around. Samurai culture carried a long-standing, though not strictly legal, expectation that both sides of a violent quarrel should face consequences, regardless of who struck first. Yoshihisa had no domain that could be confiscated, since his income came as a stipend rather than land, and he hadn't retaliated when he was attacked, which some contemporaries actually praised as proper restraint for a man of 60 facing an attacker half his age. Other voices went the opposite direction. A satirical verse making the rounds afterward mocked Naganori instead, for botching the job, arguing a real swordsman would have stabbed Yoshihisa rather than slashing at him from behind and only wounding him. None of that mattered to Naganori's furious retainers back home. To them, Yoshihisa's restraint looked like he was simply getting away with something, and that reading became the resentment that festered for the next 2 years. The shogun presiding over all of this makes the contradiction even sharper once you know who he actually was. Tokugawa Tsunayoshi is remembered today as the Dog Shogun, a nickname earned through animal protection laws so strict that a man was executed in 1686 for nothing more than killing a swallow, and he also passed measures specifically aimed at making sure the sick, the elderly, and the poor weren't simply left to die in the street. This was the same ruler who ordered Naganori's death within 6 hours, and who would later spend weeks agonizing over what to do with the men who killed Yoshihisa in return. Tsunayoshi governed a country that had been completely demilitarized for a century under the Tokugawa peace, where samurai everywhere were quietly turning from sword-wielding warriors into paper-pushing bureaucrats. The law required them to shuttle constantly between their home provinces and the capital under a system called Sankin Kotai, alternating residence year after year specifically so the shogunate could keep their families close enough to control. Naganori and Yoshihisa were both products of that system, two men whose entire professional lives revolved around court ceremony rather than actual combat, which is what makes the violence in the Corridor of Pines so strange to begin with. The men who eventually became famous as the 47 Ronin didn't start out united, and they certainly didn't start out planning a raid. Naganori left behind 270 former retainers once his domain at Akko was confiscated. And most of them simply moved on, taking new positions or quietly resuming ordinary lives. A faction of hardliners in Edo, led by the 76-year-old Horibe Yahe, wanted to attack Yoshihisa's mansion within days of Naganori's death, but they called it off once they realized his household was on alert and backed by his wife's powerful Uesugi relatives. So the group traveled to Akko instead and joined the domain's chief retainer, Oishi Kuranosuke Yoshio, who spent the next several months trying every option except revenge. He petitioned the shogunate to recognize Yoshihisa as equally at fault. He considered barricading the castle in open defiance of the government. More than anything, he hoped Naganori's younger brother would simply be allowed to inherit a smaller version of the domain and keep the family's name alive through ordinary channels. None of it worked, and the surviving record makes clear how long that failure took to actually sink in. Only after the brother was quietly moved into permanent custody with a distant branch of the family, more than a year after the original attack, did the men around Oishi finally accept that the domain would never be restored through petition. Even then, the shape their anger eventually took owed something to a Confucian scholar named Yamaga Soko, who'd spent 8 years as a guest teacher for the Akko domain decades earlier and had even helped design the layout of Akko Castle itself. Soko's writings on loyalty, frugality, and duty later got folded into what became known as Bushido, and Oishi happened to be one of his actual students. Whether that philosophy caused the decision to take revenge or simply got used afterward to justify it is something historians still argue about today, mostly because the texts drawing that connection were mostly written by people working long after the fact. What followed was an 18-month campaign of patience disguised as collapse. Oishi let himself be seen drunk in public, apparently abandoned by his own family, spiraling into open disgrace. And he did it specifically because Yoshihisa had hired men to watch him for exactly this kind of plot. The performance worked. Meanwhile, 7 or 8 quiet locations around Edo served as genuine meeting points, where the group kept planning in secret, narrowing down from the original 270 retainers to a core of just over 40 men willing to risk their lives. One of them reportedly married the daughter of the man who'd built Yoshihisa's mansion, purely to get a copy of its floor plan. Another became a regular student of Yoshihisa's own tea ceremony instructor, just to track his daily movements. By the time they were ready, they knew exactly where their target lived, who guarded him, and which rooms he was likely to be in at any hour of the night. The raid happened on the night of January 30th, 1703, in heavy snow, and it looked nothing like the lightly armed romantic ambush you see in later prints and plays. The men wore mail-lined cloth hoods and jackets that were, in reality, standard-issue firefighting gear, borrowed straight from ordinary samurai equipment, not anything specially made for the occasion. They split into 2 equal groups at Yoshihisa's front and back gates, smashed the locks with mallets when no keys turned up, and immediately hammered iron clamps into the door of the barracks housing his lower-ranking troops, sealing roughly 150 men inside before they could even wake up. Archers went up on the rooftops too, not for dramatic effect, but to shoot down anyone who tried to slip out and raise the alarm. This was a planned military operation against a household of around 180 people, and the attackers treated it exactly like one. The popular image of the raiders themselves gets it wrong too, in a smaller but telling way. Most prints and stage productions show the 47 Ronin in distinctive black and white triangle-patterned jackets, bareheaded except for a samurai's white headband, swinging their main swords like the heroes of any other samurai drama. What the real raiders actually wore was far less dramatic: cloth and mail hoods reinforced with a leather hem, indistinguishable from the standard-issue gear any samurai household kept on hand for fighting urban fires. Since Edo burned constantly, and everyone needed equipment for it, nobody who passed a man in that hood on the street would have given him a second look. And while every account agrees the raiders carried their 2 swords as a mark of samurai status, only 7 of the 47 actually relied on a sword as their main weapon once the fighting started. The rest carried spears, ladders for scaling walls, wooden mallets for smashing locked gates, and in 2 cases simple bows, used specifically to shoot down anyone trying to flee and sound the alarm. Critics at the time jumped on exactly that detail, arguing that leaning on bows and spears instead of swords proved the raiders were too cautious to be real swordsmen, conveniently ignoring that spears and bows had been Japan's dominant battlefield weapons for centuries before anyone decided the sword deserved to be romanticized above everything else. And that criticism wasn't an isolated complaint. The Hagakure, one of the defining texts on Bushido written not long after the raid, openly attacked the 47 Ronin for taking so long to act, insisting that a true samurai would have struck Yoshihisa in the first rush of anger instead of spending 18 months on a calculated plot, and that men capable of that kind of patience had simply thought too much and felt too little. Other commentators went even further, calling the whole raid an underhanded act of murder dressed up as honor, since 17 other men, none of whom had personally wronged anyone, died defending a household the attackers had spent a year and a half quietly studying. The admiration this story enjoys today was never universal, not even among the samurai class it's supposed to represent at its absolute best. Those 17 men died fighting in their sleeping robes, against attackers who'd spent 18 months preparing for that exact night. Their names survive in the records. Men like Kobayashi Heihachiro and Shimizu Ichigaku, who fought hard enough that the attackers suffered no deaths of their own, just a single minor injury from a fall. Almost no monument exists for any of them today. The one exception sits in a tiny park in modern Tokyo called Matsusaka Park, built right on the site of the mansion's old wall, where a single stone lists the names of Yoshihisa's loyal retainers and draws a fraction of the crowd that flocks to the memorials built for the men who killed them. Yoshihisa himself never fought back at all. He went straight into hiding the moment the attack began, leaving his own son, Yoshihisa, to take the lead defending the household, badly wounded in the process, only for the shogunate to later strip Yoshihisa of his position and exile him anyway, supposedly for failing to protect his father fast enough. Yoshihisa was eventually found hiding in a small charcoal storehouse in the courtyard, identified by lantern light, and beheaded on the spot. His head was wrapped in his own robe and carried on a spear roughly 10 kilometers across Edo to the temple of Sengakuji, where the men laid it in front of the tomb of Asano Naganori and burned incense, treating the whole act as a continuation of the killing their dead lord had failed to finish 2 years earlier. Even the number 47 turns out to be far less solid than the legend lets on. One of the raiders, an Ashigaru foot soldier named Terasaka Kichimon, vanished sometime during the march to Sengakuji, either sent ahead on a secret errand to inform Naganori's widow, or, according to a less flattering theory, simply fleeing before the consequences caught up with him. Because he wasn't present when the others were sentenced, some records only count 46 men in total. A separate conspirator named Kayano Sanpei had already taken his own life 11 months before the raid even happened, torn between joining the plot and a forced adoption into another family, and some shrines today still count him as a 48th participant, depicted in smaller statues wearing court robes instead of armor specifically to mark that he was already dead. As for Terasaka, he lived an ordinary life for another 4 decades and died peacefully in 1747, a remarkably plain ending compared to the dramatic ones later invented for him on stage. The shogunate's response to the raid moved nothing like the speed it had shown against Naganori 2 years earlier. His execution had taken 6 hours. Deciding what to do with the 47 Ronin dragged on for weeks instead, because the shogun's own council was genuinely split between condemning an illegal conspiracy and praising an act of loyalty. Confucian scholars were formally brought in to weigh the question, and the surviving opinion of one of them, Ogyu Sorai, lays out the contradiction in plain terms. Their loyalty was admirable, and it showed they understood honor correctly, but the law still had to come first, or there would be no respect left for the law in the entire country. The final sentence split that difference exactly the way Sorai had argued for. The men were condemned to death for conspiracy and disturbing the peace, but allowed to die by seppuku rather than common execution, a distinction that mattered enormously in a status-obsessed society, since it meant the shogunate was punishing the act without denying they'd died as samurai. 46 of them carried out that sentence on the very same day, March 20th, 1703, and were buried beside the master they'd avenged. None of this stopped a hit play from showing up almost immediately. Within 12 days of the mass suicide, A theater in Edo had already staged a thinly disguised version of the story, dressed up as an old legend about completely different historical figures, a common trick for dodging censorship of anything resembling current events. That particular play got shut down fast, but others followed, and by 1748 the version that actually mattered arrived. A kabuki and puppet play called Kanadehon Chushingura, written by a team of 3 playwrights, who renamed every character, shifted the setting back centuries, and turned Yoshihisa into a cartoonishly greedy villain trying to extort the noble young lord before getting exactly what he deserves. It's this play, not the historical record, that gave the world the costumes, the names, and the version where Yoshihisa is a coward instead of a man who simply chose not to fight back against a younger attacker. Chushingura has been staged well over 200 times in Edo alone since it debuted, and more than 50 stage versions and 40 films have followed since. The most telling detail of all might be what happened once the legend had completely taken over. In the years following the Meiji Restoration of 1868, the new imperial government sent an official message to Sengakuji, praising the 47 Ronin's loyalty and devotion as an example for the whole nation, even 100 generations later. 5 years after that, in February of 1873, the same government issued an imperial decree formally outlawing private revenge of exactly the kind the 47 Ronin had carried out, declaring that nobody had the right to take justice into their own hands, regardless of the grievance involved. Japan's government celebrated the most famous vendetta in its history and banned the practice forever within the same decade. And that contradiction tells you almost everything about how thoroughly a legend can outgrow the facts it was supposedly built on. 2 very different places in modern Japan keep that split verdict alive. In Tokyo, the temple of Sengakuji still draws a steady stream of visitors who burn incense at the graves of all 46 executed men beside Naganori's own tomb. And the Oishi Shrine in the old castle town of Banshu-Ako, hundreds of kilometers away near Kobe, goes even further. Lined with stone statues of every raider and a gift shop selling drums and towels celebrating them as folk heroes. Elsewhere, in Aichi Prefecture, the Kira family's own temple of Kezoji keeps an entirely different version of events just as carefully. The temple holds 3 separate effigies of Yoshihisa at different ages, every single one of them dignified rather than villainous, and one author who visited in the 21st century described sitting in the garden there while a priest calmly explained that nearly everything he'd ever read about the 47 Ronin was complete nonsense. 3 centuries later, both versions of this story are still being told, in 2 temples a few hours apart. What actually happened in 1701 and 1703 was smaller, slower, and far less clean than the story that replaced it. A young lord with no recorded grievance attacked an older official who'd personally trained him, was executed the same day without a trial, and left behind 270 men who mostly just got on with their lives. A core group of just over 40 spent a year and a half pretending to fall apart while quietly building a real military plan, killed 17 men defending a household that has almost no memorial today, and then argued for weeks afterward in front of a government that genuinely couldn't decide whether to honor them or condemn them. In the end, they got both. The legend turned that whole mess into a clean story about loyalty and justice, and the play built on top of it became so popular that it replaced the history underneath, name and all, for nearly 250 years, until somebody finally bothered to check.